What is spiritual recognition or recognition energy? In today's video, I'm going to talk about some ways it might show up in your spiritual journey and why it's important. Hey everyone, I'm Sonja. Welcome to Holiness Connection. Welcome to Oneness Practices if you're viewing this from my Substack newsletter. And happy Easter to those of you who celebrate. And I was inspired for this particular topic by Jesus and the recognition of his followers towards him. So I'll start off just with that. Father Bruno Barnhart, who was the prior of a monastery in California, actually talked about this term recognition energy, talking about this recognition energy of Jesus's followers at that choice point of deciding to follow him. And Cynthia Bourgeault points out, that we have this hindsight about Jesus and any other times of spiritual recognition as well. We have the hindsight, right? That it feels like, well, of course, that Jesus would be recognized. But, if you think about being at the time before everything else played out afterwards, up till now, there wasn't that yet, right? That wasn't known to these people. These people were, you could say, relying on or trusting in this recognition energy and making that choice to follow him in their lives, often, giving up what they were doing and becoming followers. And so it's important to note that realizing the hindsight can help us understand that sort of pure moment of recognition. And Cynthia also broadens the definition a bit when she's speaking of Bruno Barnhart's description of the spiritual energy by saying that it is the capacity to ground truth, a spiritual experience in your own being. So for the rest of the video, I'm going to talk about some ways that this might show up, but not exclusive at all, just the ones that occurred to me as I was writing this content out. And then just speak a little bit about why it's important to notice, cultivate, and trust the spiritual recognition energy. Okay, the first kind of spiritual recognition or spiritual recognition energy that I want to talk about is around moral rightness or wrongness, which might sound pretty intense. And definitely here, there's a caveat that sometimes when we're in this domain of like whether something's right or wrong, we do need to keep in mind sort of our own limiting beliefs and our own projections. Sometimes what our mind leaps to as the explanation for what we're feeling is actually, based on something more like that. And so it isn't always like we might be correct about something, for example, feeling off morally, but sometimes our explanation for why that is, that we leap to, is colored by, other things like projections, like I mentioned. And so we do need to keep that in mind, that we can still trust that we're sensing something that's off, but then still, having some exploration around any explanations that we come to in our minds about that. So let me just give you an example of what this might look like. I mean, I think we all, in a way, can think of this just as sort of that gut sense of our conscience, for example, in certain cases. But I had an experience, quite a few years back. There's so much political divisiveness in this country, for sure, maybe around the world. I'm in the United States. And some years ago, I was watching kind of a political comedy kind of show where they would talk to people. And it was kind of like meant to be, humorous and light, but around, the other side's like beliefs and how they were talking about things, kind of like that it was illogical. And I very much like comedy. I wasn't really even like thinking about it one way or the other. It just felt light to me. It didn't feel like it had to do with like any particular, berating other people or anything like that. However, there was a moment when a man was speaking that they were sort of doing this, interview with, putting the mic up there. And he said something to the effect of, there's just something very wrong. Like there's just something very going wrong or going wrong in this. I can't remember if he said specific to the country, or if he said it more generally. And then, he talked I think he talked more about like what he thought that was. And then it was sort of like the butt of the joke, like, I guess that he would think that way. And just as he was speaking, I knew two things. I knew that it was wrong, like what was happening. Like I could feel the dehumanization in this sort of like making fun of this person who was, trying to explain what was important to them. And so that was like the example of feeling that it was off and that it was wrong. And I made the decision not to actually watch anything like that going forward. Um, the second part was that as he spoke and said the thing about, something being off or wrong, I felt, I just recognized that as a deeper truth. We disagreed about the specifics about why that was, but I would recognize that deeper truth that he was sensing into, that was also there. And so that's actually a transition into number two for how the spiritual energy, the spiritual recognition energy might show up. And that is that you just might recognize this deep sense of truth about something, that you hear, that you witnessed. And in this case, this man who I quote unquote disagreed with, like in the particulars and sort of the mind level of what he was saying about why things felt wrong to him, I felt that like resonance, that resonant truth, that deeper truth, that recognition of it when he said, there's something wrong, like there's something just off or wrong here with what's going on. And so deeper truth and recognizing that is another way that the spiritual recognition energy can show up. A third way that the spiritual recognition energy can show up is in a sense that we are in a liminal space, kind of between things, or particularly maybe that we have this sense that we are about to transform. And sometimes this can last a really long time. Sometimes it's short, and sometimes it can last a really long time, and we feel like something's coming, but we're just not quite there yet. And me saying the phrase something's coming actually reminds me that I was going to say it reminds me this kind of spiritual recognition energy that's about a transformation or a turning point in our lives reminds me of that song in West Side Story, Something's Coming. And so it's actually called that, Something's Coming. And it's having that sense. Often just it's more the sense, a felt sense of it that we're aware of if we take the time to sense into it or to have an awareness of it. So it's mostly just that feeling sense of that coming, like the song says. Sometimes it can show up in other ways, like maybe our dreams become particularly intense, or they just feel like they're just suddenly much deeper and full of meaning. So that is another way that the spiritual recognition energy can show up. And then a fourth and final one for today, and I'm sure there's many more, is around a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, as you may know, especially if you are on my Substack newsletter, Oneness Practices, where I go into this in even more depth and more focus than this channel, even though I cover it here as well, which is around our deep connection to each other and our fundamental oneness. Now, I've mentioned in a previous video that I had an experience one time with a young woman who I was at a retreat with and seemed to be projecting stuff onto me. I, didn't feel like I was feeling particularly reactive about it or anything, but I just noticed that she seemed to have an issue with me, and I wasn't, really sure why, but it felt like it was probably a projection of some sort. And that then when we, I think not accidentally, ended up as partners in an exercise that we did where we were mirroring and doing sort of a mirroring dance, that I just stayed really present and open feeling towards her. And then there was this moment when I felt like something shifted in her. And we never talked about it, but it just shifted, and she was smiling at me and we were dancing, and it's like she got it. She got something. And what is that, right? What is that? And I don't think it necessarily matters what it is, like what we call it and how we conceptualize it. But, some people might say it was that she sensed into my essence. So we could think of this recognition of the oneness as where we sense into the whole. That can happen, right? We feel sort of a unitive experience of being part of a whole. Sometimes it might be an essence to essence kind of feeling. And so whether it's energetic, whether we call it energetic or spiritual or heart field, if we want to go into that more physical energetic description of it, whether we want to call it sometimes an intuition of something, whatever like words we want to put on that, it's an experience of that deeper connection with the whole or with others. And so that's another way that spiritual recognition energy can show up. So, why is this important? Why is it important to acknowledge our spiritual recognition energy? Why is it important to trust it? Maybe to work with it? So, one reason is that it can be helpful to our spiritual growth. It's, when we start to trust something like that, then we, notice it more and more, and we can follow along with what feels right for us, maybe not get into blind spots as much. That's a whole other discussion whether, we need to be in blind spots sometimes and they're just a natural part of the spiritual path. But it can very much be part of our spiritual growth and our spiritual journey to notice these moments of recognition and to trust them. Another important aspect of recognizing and trusting our spiritual recognition energy and times when we have spiritual recognition is that it can help us to trust things. I'll just say things. I really mean so many different kinds of things, right? Like it can help us to trust those times and those moments, and that deeper level that's not just sort of our typical mind-oriented ways or our societally ingrained with various kinds of beliefs ways. So that can help us, for example, get into an expanded awareness perhaps more easily and to trust that. It can help us to feel into the greater abundance and all is wellness that I talk about a lot in this channel, more in a space of gratitude, for example. So it can help us to be more into those kinds of states of consciousness or ways of, interacting in our lives and how we're living in our lives when we trust the spiritual recognition moments and energy. And then a third way, and this is getting back to the one close to my heart again and my work, is that spiritual recognition energy can help us to cultivate the oneness. So it's something that I not only believe is possible, but emphasize, like I said, sometimes on this channel and very much so in my Oneness Practices Substack, which if you want to learn about getting onto that free newsletter, see the description box below. But, we can practice it. Part of it is being aware of the oneness, but we can also practice it by noticing it, by cultivating it. I have things like guided meditations that I'll be sharing more of here soon too, that are other ways of practicing it. So we can practice it in person with someone. We can practice sort of ahead of time or like to be more in that state by doing guided meditations. So by trusting that kind of spiritual recognition, the spiritual recognition of the oneness and of deep connection with others, that provides this whole other way that we can be with each other, that we can be aware of our place in the whole. So I'd love to hear any other thoughts that you have about this. Are there other kinds of spiritual recognition that you've noticed in your experiences? Are there other ways that you find it so helpful? I mean, it can really be touchstones for us too. I guess that really could be a fourth one, right? Like, is that it can provide this spiritual touchstone on our spiritual journeys that we remember, like if we have big spiritual recognition moments. Hopefully, though, we can start to recognize them, sort of at all different levels, those really big ones that we always remember, and also the smaller ones. Or, like I said, even the ones we're cultivating as we go forward on our spiritual journeys and in the world. Thank you so much for listening to the video, for considering this content and how it might interact with your own spiritual journey. And I would love it if you would like and subscribe if this content resonates with you. And like I said, if you're interested, especially in this kind of deep connection and cultivating oneness, then I definitely encourage you to get on that Substack newsletter.